You're listening to the Thesis Review Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Wellick. I'm a PhD student at New York University, and my research focuses on machine learning, natural language processing, and structured prediction. On the Thesis Review, I'll interview researchers from around the field, centering the conversation around their PhD thesis. In addition to covering the technical content, this will give insight into their history as a researcher, allow us to revisit older ideas, and provide a valuable perspective on how their research and the field itself has evolved since their PhD days. My guest today is Sebastian Ruder, who is currently a research scientist at Deepmind. Sebastian's research focuses on transfer learning for natural language processing and making machine learning and NLP more accessible. His PhD thesis is titled Neural Transfer Learning for Natural Language Processing, which he completed in 2019. In today's conversation, we discuss transfer learning from a technical and a philosophical perspective and talk about its societal implications. We focus on his work on sequential transfer learning and on cross-lingual learning, which now form a foundation for his work today. Be sure to check out Sebastian's blog, which contains many great articles, including technical surveys and advice for researchers. There are links to his thesis and papers that we mention in the show notes. And now, here's Sebastian Ruder with Neural Transfer Learning for Natural Language Processing on the Thesis Review. In the introduction to your thesis, you mentioned that learning from a blank slate, similar to how you might have a randomly initialized neural network and then you train it with supervised learning, this is kind of antithetic to how humans learn or acquire language. So to what extent do humans learn from scratch versus, say, transfer other skills? And does this kind of motivate at a high level some of these methods that we'll talk about with transfer learning?
Yeah, that's a great, very philosophical question to start us off. I think, on the language side, I think that roughly aligns with the nature versus nurture debate that is kind of common in the field of linguistics. And I think on a broader side, in terms of transfer learning, I think that's something that a lot of people have been thinking about. I guess you could argue from both sides, both that through evolution we have our brain and the layout of our neurons and the physiology of our brain has evolved to a state that already might encode already a significant amount of inductive biases and gives us the necessary foundation and precondition to actually learn successfully in the real world. But then again, I don't think it's totally understood yet how much actually this kind of wiring of our neurons, how important that is in practice. Because in general, generally we as humans rely on learning about the world, learning language throughout childhood or as babies, and particularly this embodied learning stage and being exposed to sound, language, vision, different signals is very important as well in the learning process.
Your thesis focuses on transfer learning for natural language processing. Could you just give a high-level summary of what is transfer learning?
Sure. Yeah. So the kind of topics I'm looking at in the thesis generally revolve around this common setup of having some target task or some target setting that you're interested in, where typically you do not actually have enough labeled data to learn really high-performing supervised models in practice. And what I've been looking at in the thesis is essentially different scenarios that or different methods, different settings that use some form of unlabeled data, either that is publicly available on the web or on Wikipedia, or data from other supervised tasks that might be related to the task we actually care about, and trying to learn either representations or some other knowledge that could be applicable to this task we actually care about. So generally trying to kind of isolate and extract this type of information and knowledge that might be available in some of these other signals, and trying to leverage that for our downstream setting of interest.
So, from a practical perspective, what are some reasons you might want to do transfer learning?
So in general, I think a good motivation is really that transfer learning can be useful in settings, as I just mentioned, where label data is either scarce or expensive to obtain, which in practice is probably applies to most like real world problems of machine learning in practice, other than maybe if your organization only has like one core problem that you're interested in, such as maybe having a mailing application and you only need unlabeled labeled data for that, then in that setting might be okay to get as much data as possible. But if you're dealing with different customers, if you want to have something that can work in different scenarios for different domains or even different languages, it's typically very hard to scale just crowdsourcing the label data for that directly. So in all those settings, transferring at least can help you to bootstrap or give you a very good baseline, and then you can always improve further upon that. Obviously, using additional label data if you can obtain that.
So, really helping with um, going to new tasks and reducing the amount of data that you might need.
Yeah, or just also, I think it can also be very useful in just measuring the feasibility of your approach. So, for instance, you have something, you're a task you're interested in, but you're not sure if a current machine learning method is actually would be a good way to solve that automatically. So, with transfer learning, you could get away with annotating a couple of hundred instances for that task, and then see, given those instances, do you actually get good performance, or is that task maybe too difficult or too complex for current NLP methods or current ML methods in general?
I see. So, I think you wrote a bit about this in the introduction as well. Do you think that you could view transfer learning as part of some evolutionary chain of machine learning where maybe we started with rule-based systems, then we moved up to hand designing features, then we maybe moved to designing different architectures, and now we maybe think about how do we design the set of tasks or the pre-training phases and post-training phases for our networks now that they kind of know how to learn the features themselves.
Yeah, I think yeah, like learning things from data or from large amounts of unlabeled data. I think that is a setting where, yeah, going forward, we don't we not only can learn the features but also the architectures or additional inductive biases for our model. So I think, yeah, leveraging unlabeled data, transferring or extracting whatever we can from that, and using that in our models to the best way possible. I think, yeah, that's kind of the next step, and I don't think we have yet exploited or really explored all the ways that we can use this type of information.
I see. So before your PhD, how did you like? What was your background, and how did you decide to start a PhD?
Sure, yeah. So my background before coming to the PhD was mainly in computational linguistics. So I was always, or kind of before, interested in both math and languages, and interested in better understanding languages and modeling them computationally. Um, and throughout my undergrad, I got like more interested in using machine learning methods to solve tasks in natural language as well. And then for going to the PhD, I think at that time it was just when neural methods or deep learning based methods for NLP were really only starting to take off. So,
Hmm.
and I think, yeah, like at that time in 2013 or 2015 when I started the PhD, that was, I think, very exciting time where a lot of unexplored areas became, or where a whole new set of methods became to open up. So I think that partly motivated me going into the PhD as well, because I was really excited and interested about delving into those unexplored areas in NLP.
Hmm. And when you started the PhD, did you have an idea that you were interested in this transfer learning, or at what stage did that kind of take your interest?
Yeah, I think for everyone has a different journey as part of the PhD, and in most cases, it's very much non-linear, as was the case in my case too. I thought initially I had a good idea of what I would like to do in the PhD, but then quickly realized that the setting I was interested in. So the initial problem I worked in throughout my PhD was in modeling and determining who has written a specific piece of text. So in NLP, that is called authorship attribution, and typically you have like a very like a specified set of authors, and it's usually treated just as a classification task. That's something I worked on in the beginning, which I thought was very interesting, but I realized that I didn't want to spend my whole PhD just working on a very specific problem, which didn't have as big implications as I would have liked. So from there, I worked on different other tasks that were related to the types of problems the company I was working with was working on. So most prominently, just sentiment analysis, which is kind of a classic or very popular classification task in natural language processing. Um, and but working on those different, very much applied problems in different domains related to sentiment, I realized that the most interesting scenarios actually in the real world and the settings I was most excited about were really ones which had limited amounts of data available, and and this was what mainly motivated me to kind of look for other settings where there's also the scarcity of data.
That's really interesting. So then you had this, so it was at Alien you're working at during the PhD,
Mhm.
and the kind of practical methods that you're working on ultimately motivated investigating this topic.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that's one thing I like about transfer learning or this general research area, because it asks both very fundamental or philosophical questions that you alluded to in the
Mhm.
beginning, but it's also very practical in that, as we might discuss later, many of the recent methods that have been developed in this area are really what is driving NLP applications in industry too.
Yeah, just some more historical. So, how did you set up that PhD between Alien and then the Insight Center?
Sure, yeah. So to give a bit of background, so during my PhD, I did an industry-based PhD. So throughout my PhD, I worked with a company, which in my case was a small startup that was doing natural language processing, mainly focused on news analysis and news classification, generally in trying to extract information out
Mm.
of news or social media data. And what initially drew me to that was that I kind of like this applied aspect. So I was interested in not only having working on theoretical problems, but wanted to have something that can be applied to the real world as well. And being in that company gave me the excuse for working on those types of problems. And yeah, secondly, I was very fortunate that I had supervisors on both the industry and the academia side who gave me a lot of freedom to chart a bit my own course and didn't really constrain me too much in the types of problems I had to work on. So yeah, I know that in some other PhD programs or particular programs in Europe, I'm aware of, often you're tied to a particular project or a particular problem domain, and in those cases, it can be a bit hard to really like find like work on a completely different project. But even within kind of more of a constrained setting of an overall topic area, I think it's still useful to kind of explore and find your personal niche or what you're really most excited about in that area.
Hmm. I see. Yeah, so the freedom kind of allows this nonlinear path that you mentioned, and yeah, that's been a common theme in interviews and in my own case as well, where
Yeah,
kind of you kind of stumble around at the beginning and then eventually find something.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So then let's talk about the thesis then. So I really liked how you did this, where the beginning kind of gave a full review of transfer learning and set it up and divided it into different sort of subtypes. So I thought maybe we talk through this taxonomy that you have, which divides up transfer learning into well, 2 high level types and then 4 lower level types.
Uh, Sure, yeah. So the taxonomy that I mentioned, or that I have proposed in the thesis, I didn't come up all by myself. So this is mainly based on some prior work from Pan and Yang, from a taxonomy they proposed in 2010 already. So now like a decade ago, in a survey on transfer learning, that was probably one of the most kind of influential or most eye-opening papers that I read during my PhD, because that in the beginning, when I was like reading different papers that all mentioned like transfer learning or so, but I didn't really have a good grasp on what that actually meant. That survey, I think, was one of the first papers which really brought a bit of clarity in there, because they kind of clearly, with examples in the work at that time, really outlined what kind of factors or what kind of aspects could be used to differentiate these different settings. And in my thesis here, I basically just extended and built upon that and tried to make it a bit more contemporary by updating it in a way to the settings that I perceive to be most important or most popular these days in the field of natural language processing. And those, as you mentioned, so broadly, you can kind of see transfer learning as consisting of two high level distinctions. So whether you're dealing, so you always have a source setting and a target setting, and in one branch of this taxonomy, you're dealing with the same task in both settings. What is different is that you typically deal with different domains than between the two settings. And in the second branch, you try to adapt between two different tasks. And now in this first branch, people have referred to that as transductive transfer learning, because you try to, like similar to transductive reasoning, you try to generalize from some specific instances to specific target instances still in the same task. And there, people kind of in work that people have been working on, differentiate between whether you're adapting between different domains, which is normally known as domain adaptation, or the other setting that is very common in NLP, whether you're adapting between different languages. So in that case, your source setting could be a language such as English, where you have a lot of data available. But what you actually care about is doing well in a language which has much fewer resources. And now you try to leverage somehow the knowledge that you have from English together with some multilingual knowledge and do well on this new language. And in the second setting, we try to adapt between different tasks. And there, the differentiation that I've observed is mostly whether label data for the tasks is available at the same time, or whether you want to do well on all of those tasks. So in the first case, people are typically treating that as multitask learning. So you try to learn multiple tasks simultaneously in a joint model. And ultimately, you might only want to do well in one of those tasks or on all of them. And in the second case, you typically have some sort of surrogate or some sort of proxy task that you try to use to learn general purpose representations, and then apply those to a second task. And that I've referred to here as sequential transfer learning. And I think what was particularly interesting in this, in like coming up or developing this taxonomy, is that even though I think the sequential transfer learning one is now what makes up most of the research in NLP and transfer learning at the moment, it's still something that has, of course, seen a lot of work in, or at least some amount of work in ML before. And previously, one kind of sector of this work was known as self-taught learning, and already kind of in 2007, mainly people for computer vision, but also in NLP, basically looked at how you can learn representations from unlabeled data that doesn't necessarily have to do anything with your target task, and try to learn representations at that point with using some sort of sparse coding or PCA or something like that. to extract knowledge for your downstream task.
If people are familiar with the kind of current approach of training, say, a very large language model or mass language model, and then fine tuning it for a specific task, that would fall under this sequential transfer learning, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So this sequential, that's why, yeah. So the sequential aspect here is really to try to emphasize the difference to multitask learning, where you have multiple tasks available at the same time, whereas in the sequential case, typically you have your pre-training task where you, using mass language modeling, typically learn representations with your transformer model, and then once you're done with that, you basically completely discard this pre-trained task and then just fine-tune your representations on some downstream task. Yeah, as we've seen in some work, actually doing like this sort of multitask fine-tuning, so still doing multitask learning with your pre-training tasks as well, can help a test time, particularly if with the data from a different distribution. But generally, yeah, you would not use the complete unlabeled corpus that you previously used.
I see. And then can you mix and match these in practice? So could you do sequential transfer learning and have cross-lingual learning on different domains?
Yeah, pretty much. I think there's exactly these whole synergies, like the whole these different settings are basically kind of the most like the simplest cases where we have data from the same distribution or similar domains at least. But if you have different tasks and also introduce domain shift or shift in language as well, you can try. Yeah, you would assume that just a sequential transferring approach might not perform as well as you might like. So you can try to leverage methods from these other areas as well. And in fact, that's what people have been mostly doing for cross-lingual learning, at least, where typically people are doing some sort of sequential transfer learning, where they also learn general-purpose multilingual representations now on large amounts of unlabeled data of different languages, and then use that for then again fine-tune those representations on data on high-resource language, and then apply them to some low-resource target language.
I see. So then if you look back, I mean, maybe it wasn't too long ago, but the field moves very fast. Would you now add or modify this taxonomy at all?
I think, I mean, yeah, this was only since like last year, so it already factored in developments such as Elmo or BERT as well, which were probably the most prominent developments in recent NLP. Um, and since then, I don't think there have been any like too fundamental changes to the overall taxonomy. I think it still mostly holds up. So I'm not aware. I haven't seen too many too many use cases yet which entirely fall out of this taxonomy. One topic area that I didn't mention here, or where I haven't seen much work on, but which has been kind of explored a bit in the previous literature, was known as unsupervised transfer learning, where basically you don't even have labeled data in your task available, but your target task is some sort of unsupervised clustering. And in that case, you just try to use your unlabeled pre-trained representations to learn representations that hopefully cluster your target data also in a meaningful way. And that's something that I guess falls under sequential transferring too, but could be its own category too. And that's something I haven't seen too many people working on yet. I think the only application of that I've seen recently was people using some sort of unsupervised clustering to disentangle or to differentiate different languages in social media data, where they also assume that your pre-trained representations capture the differences between the languages.
I see. So yeah, maybe a more just speculative question. I was thinking about, so in this taxonomy or in the definition of transfer learning, we have these discrete divisions of source and target task. Whereas if I just step back and think about like a human, as we kind of go about through the day, multiple tasks kind of flow together. So do you maybe see, maybe far in the future, that this distinction between source and target starts to become blurred, and maybe the model itself like learns different latent tasks which we don't actually specify are different than the source?
Yeah, I think that's a really a very natural progression. I think in the near term, probably a kind of even more natural or short-term kind of direction here is between the shift between different domains. Because with
Mhm.
domains, more probably even more so than tasks, it's actually like in the real world how to distinguish once you're shifting between different like environments we're using the language between your work, your social, your online personas potentially. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, even like in particular for domain and with the same task, this shift is very gradual and something that we're not really representing at all, or we're very much assuming to be very distinct and very separate. For domain annotation, people have been mostly working on product review classification or sentiment analysis, where the domains are very distinct. And in the real world, things are a lot more messy. And for instance, people like Barbara Planck have been working a lot on, yeah, or proposing kind of a much more fine-grained measurement of what is actually a domain and what different factors influence a domain. And I think for different tasks as well, very promising area in this line is lifelong learning. So um,
Mhm.
which I guess still mostly treats different tasks as entirely separate, but at least kind of has this temporal aspect to it that you learn some tasks and then have a model that can continuously learn and adapt to new tasks. So hopefully, even if your tasks slightly differ with such a continuously learning model, you would be able to adapt to them in some way.
Yeah, so I'd like to go into the cross-lingual learning, but maybe one last question before we do. I was just curious, at what stage did you do this review? So was it kind of at towards the end of your PhD as you were putting together the thesis, or just throughout? Because it's very extensive and includes a lot of content. So I was just curious.
Yeah, so I was lucky, or it managed to. Um, I wrote a couple of blog posts before where I surveyed different areas that happened to be related to transfer learning, even though they were not kind of intended to be like to cover different parts of transfer learning when I first wrote them. And in the end, I was able to use like those blog posts at least as a foundation and just update them and try to kind of fit them into this broader whole of this of reviewing the broader area of transfer learning.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think most of the I think probably most of the work kind of emerged or came to be throughout the PhD. And in the end, I just tried to make sure that it was represented the current state of affairs and was up to date with how things were like a year ago, basically. Yeah. And that also as like a piece of advice to people considering doing a PhD or like writing a thesis. I think it's very writing a whole PhD thesis in the end can be very daunting. So I think it's actually a very good idea, also for other reasons, to write a blog or to keep kind of track or to write like smaller surveys, literature reviews of smaller sub areas that you're interested in and working on, because those can in the end feed into your thesis and make it a lot more bearable, the entire writing process.
So it was assembling these different pieces that you'd kind of built up throughout the PhD.
Yeah, exactly. Fitting those together, and yeah, because I think writing like a whole survey from scratch in the end with 200 or 300 citations within a couple of months is a lot of work. But if you already have like those references and at least the pieces in place, it's a lot easier to get the whole thing together.
Mhm. Yeah, so maybe we'll talk about the cross-lingual learning.
Mhm.
Well, yeah. So first, so in your thesis, you cover all four of these areas. I think for this podcast, we'll try to cover cross-lingual and sequential, and then of course, feel free to mention the work from the other two.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, going to the cross-lingual learning. So you mentioned kind of how it differs from domain adaptation. in the sense that domain, you might have the same language, but then you're dealing with sort of sports articles versus academic papers. Where in cross-lingual learning, you're changing the underlying language. What are some goals of cross-lingual learning, and why might you want to use it?
Um, yeah, so just on the note on the motivation or the similarity to domain adaptation, just briefly, I think in some cases in the future, sorry, in the past, cross-link learning has been often compared to domain adaptation, and in very in many cases it's very similar actually. Or people have basically used similar methods for both cases, because in one sense cross-link learning can be seen as like an extreme case of domain adaptation, because rather than there just being a shift in terms of the meaning of some words or how they're used in different domains, in cross-link learning the underlying feature representations or the underlying symbols might change between the source and the target setup. And in terms of broader motivations for this research area, I think one motivation that I like to use is really anchors this from a societal perspective, in that I think cross-link learning is really one of the most impactful areas to work on for NLP, because right now um, we are really, if you look at the current NLP landscape, most of the tasks people are working in, and most of the labeled data that we have available is restricted to English or a few other high resource languages. Um, so and mm, uh, yeah, and those cover maybe like a few, like 2-3 billion speakers in the world. But most people on the world speak a large number of other languages. There's around 6,000 languages that are spoken in the world, and these are simply not covered by current NLP technologies. And what that means is that, yeah, maybe at the moment there's not being research on these languages, but as NLP technologies and ML generally becomes more pervasive, and as we can already see with applications like Google Translate or Google Assistant, as these become more pervasive, people will want to use them for their own languages. So if you only have those technologies available for a small number of languages, we severely limit the already limited access to information and technology that speakers of those languages have. Because even, yeah, and I think that's something that generally goes very underappreciated, because or is, I think, also underappreciated with cross-link learning, because we assume there's always unlabeled data available for that we can learn representations on these days. But if we look at Wikipedia or even data on the web, only a few hundred languages are actually represented there. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, generally I think it's a very big open research problem, actually, how to deal with this long tail of low resource languages in the world, and actually create services or applications that work in those languages.
I see. So yeah, thinking from a translation perspective, you could think of a low resource language as one that lacks this aligned text. But you're even saying that some languages don't even have monolingual text available on the web.
Exactly, yeah. And I think one
Yeah.
that actually, just to pitch that or to highlight that briefly, is quite related to a recent paper that we published as a theme paper at ACL. Because generally the motivation has been for cross-lingual learning that there's an abundance of monolingual data to learn representations, and generally like a scarcity of parallel data between different languages. But if we actually look or take a critical look at that and look at the real world, um, as I mentioned previously, for a lot of languages, we don't have monolingual data available to learn high quality representations. And at the same time, there are actually high quality parallel resources that we could use for learning representations. So for instance, there's like a recent corpus that was created called JW 300, based on mostly like religious texts, but which covers a lot of different domains and covers like a large number of languages. There's also the multilingual Bible, which covers more than 600 languages. And for many of the world's languages, we actually have like small lexicons that cover a lot of translation pairs between the languages. Yeah,
Mm.
and that's something that so far hasn't been used much in research at all.
I see. So even if a language is really rare, there might be a small amount of this aligned data that you could leverage.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So then at the time of the thesis, from what I gathered, the dominant approach to doing this cross-lingual learning, well, I guess the goal is you want to learn some common embedding space, and the dominant approach was to have two different embedding spaces and then learn this mapping, so a linear mapping from one space to the other. Is that a
Yeah,
fair
yeah,
explanation?
that's a good characterization. So, yeah, cross-lingual learning. What I'm surveying, at least in the thesis, I'm actually only looking at this subpart of cross-lingual learning that is really focused on learning what are known as cross-lingual word representations. So, learning a joint cross-lingual embedding space that puts words in different languages that have the same meaning close to each other in that space. In this space, people
Mhm.
have used it's kind of useful feature representations that can be used to fine tune or to use as features for some other downstream tasks if you want to do those in different languages. Um, but yeah, people, as I mentioned before, have worked on other areas of cross-lingual learning where they use different forms of domain adaptation methods or different other ways to induce information cross-lingually in an unsupervised way. So this is only part of that. But
Mhm.
arguably a part that has seen quite a quite a rise in interest and popularity recently. So there's been we wrote together with Ivan and others. I wrote a survey on that, and I think we surveyed around 50 papers that came out in like the last 3 years or so, just on that this kind of very specific topic of learning cross-lingual word representations. And since we wrote that last year, there's been yeah still a number of more papers that have studied that approach. And as you
Mhm.
mentioned, generally these methods typically start out with two separate monolingual embedding spaces, and those are usually learned with just some off-the-shelf word embedding methods like word2vec for on monolingual corpora in both of those languages. And then approaches typically just learn some way to map or to transform one of those spaces into the other one. And I think
Mhm.
one reason why this area has seen so much interest is because most of the methods that have become popular are very simple, actually, implementation-wise. So most of them are really just a linear transformation, so like a non-hidden layer neural network, basically, um, and are actually quite easy to implement too. So one package by Michael Arteche that is very popular just uses NumPy, for instance. So not even anything like
Mhm.
PyTorch or TensorFlow to learn them, but just NumPy in like 10 lines of code. And I think that this kind of simplicity is a very nice benefit of these types of methods.
Mhm. Yeah, it seems like an interesting problem to work on because it has this societal, like larger benefit that you mentioned, and then it seems like I scanned through the review. It seems like there's so many different ways to try attacking this. So I saw like there's some recent papers using optimal transport.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see. Yeah, people have been kind of applying or framing this in different ways as like optimal transport problems. We try to have some distribution and trying to transform that into another distribution. People have also treated that as point cloud matching, which is
Mhm.
mostly used in computer graphics, as far as I'm aware. We have some sort of points, and then you try to map them into another set of points using some iterative alignment methods. So yeah, it's quite and I think probably one of the most interesting lines of recent research have been treating this as some sort of generative adversarial setup where you try to train a GAN style model to learn to project or generate um, one embedding in one space into the other one. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's kind of a very, at least in terms of methodology, nicely diverse area. And but yeah, I think we can yeah talk a bit more about some issues potentially or other directions here.
So that's a good lead in. So one of the things you looked into is that there are some issues with these methods. So yeah, maybe if you could just go over kind of what you found here.
Yeah, so I mean, as people might already expect, given that this mapping that we learn between these two languages, or between these embedding spaces between these languages, is very simple. It's just linear transformation. So in practice, we might not actually expect that to hold up or be like totally generalizable to all possible scenarios. And but that's something that has not actually been studied that much, at least in the beginning of this research area, because most of the languages or the settings people focus on were actually very focused on similar languages. So often just some European, Indo-European languages, like mapping between English and German, which are linguistically quite similar. And in this
Mm-hmm.
paper, and there's been like another paper or a couple of other papers that came out a bit afterwards, we essentially took these methods and tried to expose them to more challenging setups. So settings with domain shifts and with languages that have very different characteristics from a linguistic perspective. And what we saw was that most of these methods, so in this paper, we mainly looked at methods that learn this sort of alignment in a completely unsupervised way, using some sort of GAN-based method to learn this projection between the language embedding spaces. And what we found was that this alignment actually breaks down between if the shift between the languages, so if the language similarity is too large, if the linguistic differences between the languages are too large. Um, and yeah, we kind of looked a bit closer at how the embedding spaces of these different languages are composed, in particular whether we can actually expect a model to align the structure of them in an unsupervised way. And we found that for languages that are more dissimilar linguistically, we found that the underlying structure is actually a lot more different, which makes actually finding useful alignment harder, both from a supervised perspective, and if you have an unsupervised method that tries to learn this alignment without any data, then they actually completely fail to learn any sort of meaningful transformation.
Mm-hmm. And then how do we measure the similarity between languages? Is this just using kind of known linguistic properties, or can you actually compute something based on, I don't know, the embedding space of each language?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and something that I think is still like an ongoing line of research. So in this paper, because we were very much interested in the role of the structure of the embedding space the um, on the performance of this alignment, and found that that actually like correlates quite well with linguistic similarity. We just treated the embedding spaces as graphs, as nearest neighbor graphs, and basically
Mm-hmm.
just used some metric that are based on properties of those graphs and the differences between them to
Mm-hmm.
characterize the similarity between these two embedding spaces. But since then, there's been other methods that people have proposed, actually, also taking inspiration from some of these different other research areas that I mentioned before. So, for instance, building on different measures of how difficult it is to align to different distributions, or there's been people looking at taking inspiration from network theory, so treating these as kind of community structures or networks, and
Mm-hmm.
basically evaluating the similarity between these two different communities. But in general, most of those similarity metrics were seen to correlate with linguistic similarity.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, what we've seen in a recent paper was that just kind of assuming that aligning embedding space between different languages is the full story. Actually, that doesn't tell the full story because one additional factor that kind of motivates this line of research is that for low resource languages, we actually don't have a lot of monolingual data, as I mentioned before, to train good representations in the first place. And the amount of data that we have available to train representations actually strongly affects the structure of the underlying embedding space as well. So if we just look at kind of aligning, normally if we align English to English, learned with the same algorithm with different initializations, we get a perfect alignment. But if you learn your English embedding space only on a very small, like on a smaller subset of the English Wikipedia and align that to a fully trained English space, then you actually get much lower alignment performance. And we kind of see the same thing if we look at other languages which have few data available for training them, that part of the effect of making it so difficult to find this alignment is also because we don't have enough monolingual data available to learn those representations.
Yeah, I see. So then this connects to what you did in your thesis here with this graph isomorphism, right?
Exactly. So this was this metric in terms of looking at the underlying graph structure was as a way to probe or to diagnose the similarity of these embedding spaces, um, and to basically be able to say before you do the alignment whether you're actually going to be able to learn something successfully or not.
Yeah, I found this interesting. This question of whether the nearest neighbor graphs or whether the spaces themselves kind of preserve distance or are isomorphic. Where did that idea, like, is there a reason to suspect that they would be isomorphic? Or I guess what you showed is that it really depends on the learning procedure as well.
Yeah, I mean one other reason why I like or why I think this research area is interesting is that it can teach us something about language, the nature of language, and about the relations between different languages. Um, so one interesting way I think to use or to like go at this from a linguistic perspective is to try to reason from a linguistic perspective whether we would assume that languages have different structure or represent concepts in the same way, and also there's been a lot of debates in linguistics about how much the language you speak actually influences your the way you're thinking. Basically, so this is like a much simpler version potentially of that topic. But in general, it's I think generally for anyone working in NLP, while we rely a lot or like we rely tremendously on pre-trained representations and pre-trained embedding spaces, and we now know a fair amount of what types of task-specific knowledge is captured in those embedding spaces. And we've also seen that these embedding spaces can capture some analogies and some analogical relationships, such as we've seen in the original Mikolov paper with the king and queen example. We still, don't know that well. I think just how the underlying structure, how the underlying clusters in the embedding space are formed, and in particular, what really gives rise to different structural patterns in the embedding spaces. Um,
Hmm.
and and I think this is particularly interesting in the cross-lingual setup where you can look at the influence of syntax, of the representation of different words, whether some languages have multiple words for one semantic concepts or different words, and how all of those different factors influence the structure that your model learns.
Hmm. Are there current ways that people do this cross-lingual learning that differs from this mapping-based approach?
So what we've seen recently, I mean, as I mentioned, in the beginning, most of the methods, at least like a year ago, were still based on learning these linear transformations. And I think since then we've seen a couple of new developments. So on the one hand, I think there's much more of an awareness that these representations actually break down in certain scenarios, such as between different domains or between linguistically dissimilar languages. So there's been more work on actually learning more robust methods or robust representations that don't suffer this catastrophic failure in more challenging conditions, which I think is very important. We've also seen approaches that try to relax the assumption of having two fixed modeling embedding spaces and just learning a single transformation. So some other approaches combine that with having access to parallel data or being able to update the monolingual embedding spaces at the same time, to just try to learn to make it a bit more flexible for approaches to learn alignment. Because ultimately, I think we need to go away from just learning this sort of linear alignment and introduce at least some non-linear components. I mean, people tried that originally and found that generally for similar languages, linear alignment works best, and it's a very useful inductive bias. But I think we need to have approaches that are kind of flexible enough to give up this linearity for certain subparts of the embedding space, to find a better alignment. And I think the third area that is very getting a lot more popular now is actually taking these ideas and applying them to contextual and deep pre-trained representations. So basically taking similar ideas and using them with transformer models. So instead of now learning just cross-lingual representations on the word level, recent methods have been learning a multilingual representation space that is kind of deeper or contextual, by essentially also doing something that cross-lingual word embedding methods did kind of early on in 2015, training jointly on unlabeled corpora in different languages. And that's what also these methods are doing, by just feeding in unlabeled data in multiple languages from Wikipedia or from the web. Models have actually been shown to learn surprisingly useful cross-lingual representations.
Mm-hmm. So then, in the case of these, so for instance, like one model would be this multilingual BERT. I don't remember what type of BPE encoding they use, but for instance, in the GPT-2 model, the GPT-2 model uses a encoding method that can represent any Unicode string using their BPE dictionary. So in that case, is there actually not even a distinction between languages because we're just learning these tokens and then they can represent strings in either language? I mean, we're learning the representation for the tokens that could then be used to represent strings in any language.
To give a bit more background, so most state-of-the-art NLP methods use some sort of subword tokenization, like BPE or word piece or sentence piece, which splits each word into number of subwords based on kind of frequency information in the corpus. And cross-lingual, like multilingual, deep pre-trained models have been using the same tokenization strategies, just applied to multilingual corpus now. As you mentioned, by just using this tokenization scheme, you would basically just have one multilingual vocabulary that in the vocabulary represents tokens that are shared across all of the different languages that the model has seen during pre-training. This is kind of on the one hand an advantage because now you don't need to keep separate vocabularies for each word. You can just basically apply the same model that you used monolingually with kind of the same vocabulary representation to now train a multilingual model from scratch. And You can apply that to some target language that you've seen doing pre-training as well, surprisingly well. On the other hand, we've already seen multiple instances that if you have languages that are underrepresented in the pre-trained data, those languages or the tokens in those languages will also be underrepresented in the vocabulary. So your model might do worse in those languages, which have maybe a different script that the model has not seen much before, because your model actually has not really learned well how to tokenize those languages properly or meaningfully.
I see.
Yeah. And the second downside is also something that can be a blessing and a curse. So on the one hand, you can save space, you can share representations of words that might be similar across languages. So a lot of tokens are shared across languages, such as punctuation or numerals, or even kind of proper nouns, city names like New York or so might be shared across different languages. So using the same token for those words across different languages might help your model to kind of learn better representations overall. But at the same time, your model might have the same token for a a prefix in English as like a suffix in Indonesian, for instance. And in that case, actually having the same representation in both cases might not be the best approach.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. So even with this common vocabulary, you could still have this bias towards the more common languages.
Yeah, exactly. So in the end, it's a bit, yeah, it's kind of a problem right now because generally the whole tokenization is decoupled from your actual model or your pre-training. So you learn your vocabulary before actually training the model on top of that. And the tokenization is really a factor of how much data you have in that corresponding language. And we've
Right.
already,
Yeah.
I think some people have shown that for certain languages, encoding methods such as BP or even for English actually doesn't produce very well, like morphologically segmented subwords, for instance. And it might do
Yeah.
even worse for other languages.
That's interesting. It seems like it's one of these cases where any design choice you make in one of these models ends up having some downstream impact.
Exactly, and I think in the multilingual case, that's probably even more difficult because now you don't even you kind of need to anticipate or make design choices that are good in general for a large number of languages and not maybe just suited to the biases or the nature of English.
I see. Okay. And then yeah, I guess to make sure we get through the next part, maybe just one more question on the cross-lingual. So another thing you found is that using in your thesis that using a small amount of supervised data was able to improve results. I think there you might have been using these common words across the languages. From what I gathered doing some reading, it seems like this distinction between unsupervised and uh, small amount of supervision is still a hotly debated topic. So, what's your current view on this? Should we go for purely unsupervised methods, or should we leverage data when it's available?
Um, yeah, that's a good. Yeah, that's a really good question. So regarding the what you just mentioned in terms of the using small amounts of supervision for for learning this sort of alignment, in that case, we actually used some of the lexicons that I mentioned are available for generally most languages of the world. So generally for all languages, we basically have at least a tiny amount of supervision available. And for many other languages, there's ways to obtain what people have referred to as weakly supervised data. So by relying on some assumptions of similarity about the writing systems of the different languages. So in that case, in the paper, for instance, we relied on the assumption that words that are spelled the same across different languages typically have the same or a similar meaning. So that covers cases again like numerals or New York city names or common nouns. So in that case, also having this additional supervision is basically for free. Um, and in general, I think it's useful to kind of separate like two motivations basically. We on the one hand we have the like a purely scientific motivation. I think studying unsupervised learning, kind of in the completely unsupervised case where we don't actually where we rely on no supervision at all, can teach us something, as I mentioned previously, about the nature and the relationships between different languages. It can also be kind of a useful baseline method to use, because if we use any sort of supervision, we generally would expect to be better than a method that doesn't use any supervision at all. And in addition, we can use it to like control how useful supervision actually is for our model. Um, and finally, unsupervised methods, as I mentioned before, are quite simple, at least in this area of cross-lingual learning. So if you're only dealing with linguistically similar languages, and you might actually be able to, like an unsupervised method might actually be good enough for your setting. And given that it can be implemented very fast, it might be just something that you can very quickly use as a prototype. Now this was kind of for understanding or using unsupervised learning from a very scientifically motivated perspective. I think on the other hand, for many real world scenarios or most of the settings in the real world, as I mentioned before, for most language pairs, there's actually supervision, at least some amount of supervision available, or even sentence level supervision if you're dealing with one of the commonly used languages. So in general, if you just want to improve the performance on your target setting, I think actually doing some supervised approach where you try to leverage the available supervision is typically more suitable for like a real world application.
I see. So always keep in mind the balance between scientific interest and practical application, I guess.
Exactly, and I think in general, really try to be explicit about the assumptions you're making, whether you're assuming you have supervision or no supervision, and if you use a semi-supervised approach, try to compare that to an approach that uses like the same amount of data, apples to apples, and not compare that to a method that uses strictly less available information. And if you're interested, we had as I mentioned before, a paper at ACL that touches on some of those issues too.
Okay. Yeah, I'll try to include that in the show notes. Okay, so maybe let's move to the sequential transfer learning. So as we discussed, this has become maybe the dominant, would you say, method that or paradigm that people are using today, where we maybe pre-train some large model and then fine-tune it on some downstream tasks. Um, I found so your thesis goes over this ULM fit model, and I wanted to go back and just talk about the history behind this because I found it pretty fascinating. This actually preceded these methods, like GPT, for instance. And so I wanted to ask first, like, at the time that you were thinking of doing this ULM fit, where was the idea of kind of doing this language model pre-training? Did it seem like a crazy idea, or were a lot of people trying it and just someone needed to get it to work, or do you remember?
So this whole area or the time I think was very interesting. I think both for me, so transfer learning was kind of on my mind from 2016, probably 2017, that I've been thinking about those areas deeply. And one particular source of inspiration for me personally was computer vision. So at that time,
Mm,
to my perception at least, a lot of successes in real world applications of computer vision had been achieved by using methods that were pre-trained on ImageNet. Um, and using and yeah, which basically kind of demonstrated that those models learned useful representations that could be used in other downstream tasks too. And what like personally really I found very striking was methods that analyzed and tried to look at the features and different layers of those ImageNet models. And I'm sure most of the people or many people listening to this podcast might have seen some visualizations of those, because in those days, people basically showed that the lower level layers captured kind of more granular aspects of other images, such as edges or different texture patterns, and higher level layers in ImageNet models learned representations that are most closely aligned with kind of more high level patterns, such as certain physical attributes, noses, certain body parts, other kind of distinguishing attributes from different animals or different objects. So for me, it was very inspiring to just think about these feature hierarchies and ways to learn these. And in NLP, there was not, didn't seem like that there was any comparable, or at least at that time, large scale benchmark available that learns similar representations like ImageNet. So in one gradient blog post as well, I kind of outlined or hypothesized about different potential NLP tasks that could be used to learn such useful representations. And the task, kind of at that time, that seemed to me the most useful to was language modeling, because it gives you access to firstly access to large amounts of data, unlabeled data in this fact, or as people call it now, like self-supervised data, because the unlabeled data actually gives you the supervision for training a model, and because language modeling in itself, you can kind of reason, or like a good language model already captures or should already have learned a lot of useful knowledge that kind of underlies natural language. It needs to learn something about agreement, about syntax, about which verbs or which terms agree with each other, about tense, and also about semantics and what contexts we use different words. And I mean, in fact, basically, in my thinking, methods like word2vec were kind of a simplified version of language modeling, because they also do language modeling effectively, but just in a more simplistic way, by not using a hidden layer and just predicting the surrounding context. And in 2017, 2018, basically the time seemed kind of ripe, given that we had access to more computation, like more compute and more powerful methods to revisit these types of methods and see whether we can actually learn something more using kind of higher performing models. And only after we actually came up with the approach, to Jeremy Howard and I, we came across this other work from 2015 from Diane Lee, which also already in 2015 fine-tuned kind of learned representations via language modeling, and then fine-tuned those representations on target tasks. So actually, it was not like we could have already, I think, worked on similar methods before. I think, like before 2018, I think the methods and the compute was there, probably not available to everyone, but it could still have been done, I think, before. I think one of the factors that potentially made it so that within NLP, it took a bit, or it took like until 2018 to see this rise of pre-trained representations, was just the popularity of word2vec, just because those methods were so easy to access, so easy to use, so that, and generally assumed to be standard, so that actually people didn't really think whether there would be something something high performing or more useful to do, because those already gave people kind of the gains that they wanted in their models. So I think so as I mentioned, for me, I think it was clear at that time that something similar should be possible for NLP. It just hadn't been done yet. Then, kind of with that thinking, it coincided that also Jeremy Howard, who was working on NLP for his Fast AI course, basically had similar thoughts and actually already started to prototype the first application of ULMFit, or like the first version of that for his course, by training a model on Wikipedia data, and then fine-tuning that on sentiment analysis data on the IMDb dataset. And that model already gave surprisingly good results, given how simple it was. And basically together we then decided to iterate and just try to refine this approach, which just had like a regular language model that was being fine-tuned, and really test that, how far it could go.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I guess it started with trying to maybe draw an analogy to the advances in computer vision, where we had things like pre-training on ImageNet, and then given how good word embeddings were maybe working at the time, it still takes a lot to really keep pushing in this direction and then eventually get something to work. So
Yeah, and I think one of the points which actually I think convinced people to move away from word2vec was, both, just seeing these methods work on a wide variety of tasks. In our paper, we mainly just looked at different text classification tasks because they're very applicable in the real world. And in the Elmo paper, which came out at a conference, at NACL conference before our paper, they looked at kind of even a broader, more diverse range of NLP tasks. And I think that's probably what convinced finally people, hey, okay, this is something that is actually really useful in practice. And maybe looking back at that now from 2 years ago, I think both in terms of this kind of taking inspiration from computer vision. I think now it's quite interesting looking back that many reason methods in computer vision, for instance, take, I would say, some inspiration from recent work in NLP. So there have been a lot of transformer-based methods applied to computer vision methods. And also now these days, self-supervised learning in computer vision, I would, at least my perception, is a lot, has been worked on before, but now seems to be almost like a mainstream research area, and with people like different labs working on it, and with people proposing demonstrating really surprisingly uh, good approaches that are really competitive with supervised ImageNet models with only a fraction of the number of labeled examples.
when can you maybe think back to when you first saw the initial results? Did it kind of surprise you about how well it worked, or was it maybe what you expected?
I think in the beginning it was really surprising that it worked as well as it did. Because in the end, the method was really very simple. So we just took the same, I think, 3-layer language model that produced good results from language modeling. I think that was a model from Merity et al. That was like state of the art or like pre-state of the art on language modeling at the time, and just train that as language model and then just fine tune it on labeled data, and just that with yeah just by being a bit conscious or like fiddling with the learning rate a bit, already produced very robust initial results on some tasks like IMDb, where a lot of people have been working on, where the recent methods were really used kind of a lot of different components, a lot of different feature representations, and arguably quite complex approaches. So I think, for me, probably the most convincing thing was really that this comparatively simple approach really was competitive with a lot more complex approaches already from the start. And
Mm-hmm.
I think
I see.
and overall I think that simplicity here, particularly for this pre-training fine-tuning paradigm, has been really one of the key benefits which has contributed to the wide adoption.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So then, since then, probably in part because of the simplicity, we've seen GPT, GPT-2, GPT-3 on the autoregressive language modeling side. Um, do you do you see limits to this just scaling up this paradigm larger and larger? Is GPT-10 the answer, or do you maybe see that we need to look into other of changing the model or the learning process?
Yeah, so on the one hand, I think we can still we haven't reached the limit yet where just current methods can take us. I don't think scaling up the methods or the data we yet at the time where these approaches plateau really. I think though, even for kind of more long term, or as we are looking for more complex, more open domain reasoning tasks or open domain conversational dialogue, question answering in NLP. I still think that I think that the main threat here is sample efficiency. So I possibly with infinite amounts of data and almost infinite model capacity, you might be able, like you could potentially learn everything you or most of what you'd like to know. In general, though, getting infinite data for language is like it's not possible at all, and many things that you would want to expect or expect your model to learn for certain applications are simply underrepresented or like either mentioned very, very rarely or almost not at all in data that is available online or on the web. So things like just simple common sense information that the sky is blue. We need oxygen to breathe. When you fall from a distance from a height, you die. Just things that make up the our common sense knowledge, our world knowledge that we have learned by interacting with the world, are very hard to learn just from written text alone. And I think for those types of knowledge and for tasks that require reasoning or answering questions or just simply talking about things related to those concepts, we might be able to get away with just learning from more and more data, but I think that's very sample inefficient. So what might be more useful and more scalable is to try to encode that knowledge from other sources. And I think people are looking at different ways to do that. There's a very promising line of research which tries to encode knowledge that is represented in knowledge bases, such as Wikipedia or even things like ConceptNet, which focus more on common sense knowledge. There's benchmarks which try to probe for that information. I think multimodal learning might be an interesting way to do that. So for some knowledge that is not that well represented in language, such as spatial information, you might have a better time just learning that from looking at images and how to photo directions or how the different objects in the image relate to each other, or possibly other people advocating for actually doing some embodied language learning. So for some things, you might actually be better off being having an agent and being able to actually interact physically with objects, where you might learn better about some physical properties in terms of gravity or friction or so of those objects. So I think in general it's a very still promising and like useful to test to push these methods to their limits, but in general really focusing on how we can ingest knowledge into these methods in a more sample efficient way, types of knowledge that is not currently well represented, or even approaches like Electra, which try to come up with objectives that are can learn similar amounts of knowledge with simply less data, because those might be easier scalable to other domains or other languages as well. I think all of those directions are really worth pushing on.
Yeah. So data efficiency, reasoning, logical consistency, which kind of goes with reasoning, factual knowledge, things like this. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Is there maybe anything else you wanted to highlight or point people to in the thesis or in your recent work that you're working on now?
So I think with regard to the thesis, maybe, and as the connections to computer vision might have demonstrated, I think it's always useful to look just beyond your. So if you're working on a particular project or so, to look beyond your particular application domain, look at other areas, if not if not only for the methods, but just to get inspiration for other ways to frame or to think about things. I think that is generally really useful. Another big takeaway is just to be explicit about the types of assumptions and limitations of your model. So really try to like push your model, try to expose it to challenging scenarios, and be explicit about what you're trying to code, or what are your assumptions for your model design, and what you're trying to encode or represent in your model. And yeah, as I mentioned briefly before, my current work is really mostly related or kind of builds on some of this earlier work on cross-lingual learning, mostly applying that to multilingual representation learning, just because I think there is so much interesting work that is possible in this area. And I think it's one of the most impactful areas probably in NLP, by simply enabling information access and making NLP more accessible to researchers and people wanting to deal with natural language in their own language. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, if you're looking on some application or some area to work on, I think a cross-lingual learning is very interesting. Or simply, if you have a task and you're looking to maybe annotate or to get another twist on that, I think annotating or gathering data for the same task in another language can be very beneficial as well, and might catalyze more research in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, those are some um, good recommendations for research, and I think I'll let you off the hook on the "Do you have any advice?" question, because you wrote a really great blog post about 10 useful pieces of advice for PhD students, which everyone should check out. But it's been great, like looking back at what you worked on during your thesis, and it's really interesting to see how, like what you talked about, you started off maybe not even knowing that you want to work on this transfer learning, and then especially the thing I noticed with the cross-lingual learning is that it seems like you set up a good foundation during your thesis for things that you now work on and continue to work on now.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me here. I think it's really super cool idea, and really great that you're doing this doing this podcast, which I think focuses on something that is a bit underappreciated. I mean, is such a crucial part of like PhD life and academia, PhD thesis, but it's really generally very underappreciated. I think particularly in machine learning, where it focuses so much on papers. And I think I just want to maybe, I mean, that's more of a personal opinion, but I think a PhD thesis can be very, I mean, I guess in general, there's a perception that PhD theses are rarely read in practice. But I've also read, I mean, yeah, very interesting, yeah, like number of interesting PhD theses. And I think the best ones are really those that are not just a concatenation of papers, but try to give a bit more of a like a broader overview of the research area, and connect and motivate the different research pieces you've done during your PhD. Um, and as I mentioned before, I think leading up to a PhD thesis, I think it's a really good idea if you want your parts or your thesis in the end to be a bit more widely read and to get some practice, to write some blog posts, write some early reviews as you're diving into a topic area, and publish that review as a blog post so that other people who are interested can read, and like that they already become aware that you're working on this topic. So you might get even some collaborations out of that, and in the end you can use that as a springboard for writing your thesis. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I hope, yeah, I just want to end that. Hopefully, hope that people give PhD theses a bit more love, and uh, make them explainable, and write some blog posts leading up to them.
Mm-hmm. And one day they might be featured on a podcast.
Exactly. That's like the something that I didn't expect when writing the thesis.
Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks for chatting.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me.